The bleed air system provides pressure-controlled air to the air conditioning system, the pressurization system, and the de-icing system. The engine intake is de-iced through the supply of hot bleed air to an intake cavity. This supplements electrically heating the engine intake. Bleed air is also used to pressurize the hydraulic reservoir and prevent aeration of the hydraulic fluid. Both engines normally supply bleed air for the bleed air system. If an engine malfunction occurs, one bleed system can provide sufficient air for its consumers. Bleed air is drawn from the low-pressure compressor or the high-pressure compressor. The changeover of bleed air source from low pressure to high pressure, or vice versa, is automatic depending on engine power setting. Under normal flying conditions, bleed air is used from the low pressure source. At low engine speeds, for example when power is set to flight idle, low pressure bleed air is insufficient to supply the consumers, so high pressure bleed air is used. Under normal operating conditions, the changeover between low pressure and high pressure bleed air is automatic, as long as the push buttons on the air conditioning panel are blank, indicating that the system is on. The low pressure check valve prevents high pressure bleed air entering the low pressure compressor. Locate one of the low pressure check valves on the schematic to confirm its position. Please touch the highlighted area. That's right. The pressure regulating shutoff valve controls the pressure of the air supplied to the air conditioning system. Bleed air is supplied by both engines to all bleed air consumers. Under normal flying conditions, bleed air is supplied from the low-pressure compressor via a check valve, through the pressure-regulating shutoff valve and corrosion-resistant steel and titanium ducts, and through the dorsal fin via a common duct to the rear fuselage. The common duct divides into two inlet ducts, which feed bleed air into two identical air conditioning packs. The air conditioning packs supply ventilation to the flight deck and passenger compartments. The flight, passenger and cargo compartments form the pressurized cell in the Fokker 50. Two outflow valves control the outflow of air-conditioned cabin air and so maintain the cabin pressure. Refer to the air conditioning and pressurization module to study this subject in greater detail. Bleed air is supplied to de-ice the leading edges of the wings, tail and vertical stabilizer. The hydraulic reservoir is pressurized by the bleed air system to prevent aeration of the hydraulic fluid and ensure there is a positive fluid flow to the hydraulic pumps. Bleed air controls and indicators are located on the air conditioning panel, which is located on the overhead panel. When the bleed system is operating normally, the push buttons are blank. If a fault develops in a bleed air system, an amber fault annunciator is displayed. When the system is manually switched off, a white off annunciator is presented. Does the highlighted push button indicate that the bleed air system is operating normally, manually switched off, or defective? Yes. What does the annunciation on this air conditioning panel indicate? Yes. The economy mode push button annunciates that reduced airflow has been selected. Locate the economy push button to confirm its position. This push button is usually blank to indicate that economy has not been activated and the system is operating normally. A blue on annunciation is presented if the economy push button has been selected. Note, the use of the economy mode is detailed in the System Operations section of this module. The valve closed lights indicate if a pressure regulating shutoff valve has been closed, indicating that bleed air is no longer available from the engine. Locate the right engine valve closed light. That's right. What do the valve closed lights on this air conditioning panel enunciate? Yes. The bleed push buttons enunciate if the right or left pressure regulating shutoff valves are open or closed. When both valve closed lights are illuminated, both pressure regulating shutoff valves are closed. When the bleed push button is switched off, the pressure regulating shutoff valves close and bleed air is no longer available to supply the air conditioning system, but still available for de-icing and hydraulic tank pressurization. If a propeller auto-feathers below 10,000 feet, the bleed air supply to the air conditioning system ceases to conserve engine power. Manual engine shutdown stops the supply of air from both bleed systems if the aircraft is below 10,000 feet when the power lever of the operative engine is at takeoff position and takeoff, go-around or flex is selected at the engine rating panel. Manual engine shutdown also stops the supply of bleed air if the aircraft is below 10,000 feet, the power lever of the operative engine is at takeoff position, and the landing gear is extended. At what altitude will bleed air cease completely if the propeller auto-feathers? Yes. There are 3 modes of bleed air pressure control in the Fokker 50. These are normal, where normal air pressure is supplied to the air conditioning system; economy, where reduced air pressure is supplied to the air conditioning system to conserve engine power; and augmented mode in a single pack configuration, where increased air pressure is supplied to the air conditioning system. Economy mode is selected manually by depressing the economy push button. For reasons of performance, economy mode is activated automatically when takeoff power is selected and both air conditioning packs are operative. Economy mode is also activated automatically if the engine is shut down above 10,000 feet or if a single bleed air source is selected. If the temperature switches downstream of the pressure regulating shutoff valve are activated, the associated high pressure bleed and pressure regulating shutoff valve are closed. The relevant bleed fault is enunciated on the push button and a level 1 alert is presented. If a pressure regulating shutoff valve fails to regulate pressure, the rise in air pressure will be sufficient to activate a pressure switch and cause the relevant amber fault annunciation to be presented on the bleed push button. In addition, the high pressure air will cause the opposite check valve and pressure regulating shutoff valve to close, and the opposite bleed valve closed light will enunciate. This results in a level 2 alert. If a pressure regulating shutoff valve fails to regulate pressure, if the failed pressure regulating shutoff valve remains open after the bleed push button is selected off, the opposite pressure regulating shutoff valve cannot supply sufficient pressure to open the check valve and remains closed. The fault light is extinguished on the failed side with the off selection, and the valve closed light remains illuminated on the opposite side. When an air duct leak occurs between the pressure-regulating shut-off valve and the isolation check valve, the temperature switch closes the appropriate high-pressure bleed and pressure-regulating shut-off valve. The bleed fault annunciation is presented on the bleed push button and a level 1 alert is generated. Both pressure-regulating shut-off valves close if the leakage of bleed air is detected around the common duct to the air conditioning packs, and a fault annunciation is presented on both bleed push buttons together with a level 2 alert. A fire detection system monitors any leakage of bleed air in the duct between the engine tapping and the fire wall. If the leakage is substantial, it activates the fire detection system and a fire warning is presented. Augmented mode is automatically activated to provide increased bleed air pressure when one of the air conditioning packs has been switched off. Activate the augmented mode. Please touch the highlighted area. The off annunciation indicates that you have manually switched off one pack and activated the augmented mode. If the fire handle located on the engine fire panel is pulled, the engine is shut down and the PRSOV is closed due to loss of air supply. The inoperative engine cannot provide bleed air, so it is provided by the operating engine. The check valve prevents bleed air from the operating engine leaking into the failed bleed air system. This ensures a continuous supply for bleed air consumers. Economy mode is automatically selected. Bleed air is supplied by both engines, although sufficient bleed air may be provided by one engine should a malfunction occur. Bleed air is drawn from the low-pressure compressor or the high-pressure compressor. Under normal flying conditions, low-pressure bleed is used. High-pressure bleed air is used when low-pressure bleed is insufficient. Bleed air is used for air conditioning of the flight deck and passenger compartment, de-icing the airfoils, de-icing the engine intake, and pressurizing the hydraulic reservoir. The supply of bleed air is adequate for normal operation of the bleed air system if either of the pressure regulating shutoff valves are closed.